On the afternoon of the 6th of March, 1945, a U.S. Army cameraman stood on a sidewalk in the ruined city of Cologne, in the shadow of its great cathedral, and pointed his camera down a rubble-choked street. In the next few minutes, he filmed something almost no one in the history of tank warfare ever managed to capture. He filmed a tank duel, from beginning to end, as it actually happened. An American tank and a German tank, hunting each other in the streets of a dying city, and the shot that decided it, all of it recorded on motion picture film that would play in newsreels across America within weeks. Almost every battle in history has to be reconstructed after the fact, pieced together from reports and memories and maps, with all the gaps and disagreements that come with them. This one does not. This one is on film. We can watch the tanks move. We can watch the gunfire. We can watch the men climb out afterward. It is one of the most completely documented small actions of the entire Second World War. And yet the most important part of what happened that day is the part the camera did not catch. Because the young American gunner who won that duel, whose 3 shots played on movie screens across his home country as a moment of triumph, would spend the next 70 years of his life haunted by something else that happened on that same street, in that same hour, that no film could ever put right. This is the story of the Cologne Cathedral duel. How it happened, why we know it in a detail almost no other battle allows, and why the man who won it spent the rest of his life trying to make peace with it. To understand the duel, you have to picture the place, because Cologne in March 1945 was a landscape out of a nightmare. By the last winter of the war in Europe, the Allied armies had fought their way to the edge of Germany itself and were driving for the Rhine, the last great natural barrier before the German heartland. The operation to close up to the river in this sector was called Operation Lumberjack, and one of its objectives was Cologne, Germany's 4th largest city and a crucial crossing point on the Rhine. Cologne had been one of the most heavily bombed cities in Germany. Years of air raids had reduced great stretches of it to rubble, hollow buildings and mountains of broken brick, street after street of ruins. A city that had held 750,000 people before the war had been hollowed out, most of its population fled or killed, its center a wasteland. Into this wreckage, in the first days of March, drove the American armored spearheads, entering the city from several directions at once against German troops who were determined but badly outnumbered. Above all of it, impossibly, one thing still stood. The Cathedral of Cologne, a vast Gothic structure with twin spires reaching into the sky, had been hit by bombs but had not fallen, and it rose over the devastated city like something from another world. For the soldiers fighting through the ruins, and for the cameramen following them, the cathedral was an unforgettable backdrop, a symbol of the old Europe looming over the wreckage of the new war. Every combat cameraman in the sector wanted to be the one to film American troops reaching it. The American unit fighting into the city center was the 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed the Spearhead Division, one of the most experienced armored formations in the U.S. Army, commanded by Major General Maurice Rose, an aggressive leader who habitually pushed his command right up to the front. Its tanks and the infantry alongside them were clearing Cologne the hard way, street by street, building by building, never sure what was waiting around the next corner. In a wrecked city, a single well-placed tank or gun could dominate a street, and the only way to find them was often to drive into their sights. And somewhere near the cathedral, a German tank was waiting to do exactly that. To understand why this particular duel mattered so much to the men who fought it, you have to understand the long, bitter problem that lay behind it, which was the American tank itself. For most of the war, the standard American tank had been the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was reliable, fast, easy to build and repair, and produced in enormous numbers, and those qualities mattered enormously to winning the war. But in a straight fight against the best German tanks, the Sherman was outmatched, and every American tanker knew it. Its armor was too thin and its gun too weak to deal with the German Panther and Tiger on equal terms. Time and again, American crews had watched their shells bounce off German armor, while German guns punched straight through theirs. Fighting a Panther head-on in a Sherman was, in the words the crews used, a good way to die. For years, American tankers had gone into battle knowing their machine was inferior to what the enemy could field, and had paid for it in blood. By 1945, the U.S. Army finally had an answer. It was a new heavy tank called the M26 Pershing, and it was, at last, a genuine match for the German heavies. It had a powerful 90mm gun that could kill a Panther, and thick, well-shaped frontal armor that could take a hit. But it had arrived very late, and only a handful existed. Just 20 of these new tanks had been rushed to Europe for combat testing under a program called the Zebra mission, and they were parceled out to a few hand-picked veteran crews. The idea was to see how the new tank performed in real battle before committing to it fully. To get the most out of them, the 3rd Armored Division gave its Pershings to its best crews, the men most likely to make the new machine count. One of those 20 Pershings was called Eagle 7, and it was crewed by 5 men who had been fighting together since the previous autumn and had a proud record of never losing a tank. Its commander was Sergeant Bob Early, its driver was Woody McVeigh, its loader was John DeRigi, an instantly recognizable figure because he had traded for a French tanker's helmet and wore it into battle. Its radio operator was Homer Davis, called Smokey, and its gunner, the man who did the shooting, was a soft-spoken 21-year-old from Pennsylvania named Clarence Smoyer, who was such a good shot that his crew had been given one of the precious new tanks. The price of having the best tank in the division was simple. It meant they went first. The crew had already begun to learn what their new tank could do. In an earlier action, crossing the fields toward the Rhine, Smoyer had used the Pershing's powerful gun to knock out German anti-tank guns that would have torn a Sherman apart, the 90mm shells smashing the German positions from ranges where the crew felt, for the first time, that they had the advantage rather than the enemy. They had spent years being the underdogs. Now they had a tank that could win a straight fight, and they knew it. On the 6th of March, they went first into Cologne. Waiting for them, near the great plaza in front of the cathedral, was a German Panther tank, one of the very machines that had made the Sherman crew's lives so dangerous for so long. The Panther was commanded by a German lieutenant named Wilhelm Bartelborth, and it was positioned to cover the approaches to the cathedral, hidden and waiting, exactly the kind of ambush that had killed so many American tanks. Into its field of fire, that afternoon, came 2 American Shermans of the 3rd Armored Division, moving up the street in support of the infantry. They did not know the Panther was there. They came up the street and stopped, because the way ahead was blocked by rubble, and they radioed for a bulldozer to clear it. In stopping, they had put themselves directly in the Panther's sights. The Panther fired. Its first shell struck the lead Sherman and destroyed it, and 3 of the 5 men inside were killed. For the 2 who got out, and for the crews watching, it was the old nightmare made real one more time. A single German gun killing an American tank before anyone even knew where the shot had come from. The 2nd Sherman tried to reverse out of the trap, backing frantically down the street, but the Panther was faster with its gun. It shot out the Sherman's tracks, crippling it in place, though this time the crew managed to scramble clear and take cover before a killing shot came. In a matter of seconds, the Panther had destroyed 1 American tank and disabled another, and killed 3 men, without being touched. It was a small, brutal demonstration of the exact problem the Americans had lived with for years, and it was happening in the last weeks of a war that was already all but won, which made the deaths no easier to bear. And it happened to be filmed. A U.S. Army Signal Corps cameraman named Jim Bates was up near the front of the advance, and he had been there to record the destruction of that Sherman. Bates was an experienced combat cameraman who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, where his camera gear sank into a canal, and he spent his first 2 days ashore fighting as an ordinary infantryman before he could get back to filming, and who had gone on to shoot footage at the Battle of the Bulge. He knew how to get close, and the relative lightness of the German resistance in Cologne had made him bold, pushing right up with the leading tanks to get his shots. That boldness put him in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. He had his images of the burning Sherman, grim as they were. What he did next would make him famous. Before the duel that everyone would remember, there was another moment on that street that almost no one would, except the man who could never forget it. It belongs in this story, told honestly, because it is the truth of what urban combat actually is. In the chaos and fear of fighting through a ruined city, where the enemy could be in any window and any doorway, the American gunners fired at movement. It was how men stayed alive in that kind of fighting, and it was also how the innocent died in it. Clarence Smoyer, watching his sector through his gun sight, saw movement off to his left and put armor-piercing shells through the corner of a building, hoping for a lucky hit on the hidden enemy tank. And in the middle of all this, a small German civilian car came around a corner and out into the open, into the street in front of the American tanks, at the worst possible moment. To frightened, keyed-up crews expecting an enemy at any second, a vehicle appearing suddenly was a threat. Guns opened up on it. The car was hit and slewed to a stop. A young woman was pulled from the wreck. Her name was Katharina Esser, and she was a grocery clerk, an ordinary civilian who had survived years of bombing only to be caught out on the street in the final battle for her city. She had been shot in the chest. American medics reached her and did what they could, but the wound was mortal, and she was left dying beside the car in the street as the fighting moved on around her. She should not have been there, and she did not deserve to die that way, and among the several American guns that fired on that car in those seconds, no one could ever say for certain whose round had hit her. That is the plain, ugly truth of street fighting, that it kills people who had nothing to do with the war, and that afterward no one can even be sure who did it. Smoyer feared, for the rest of his life, that it had been his. Hold on to that, because it is where this story is really going. But first, the duel. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Jim Bates found Sergeant Early's Pershing idling in the streets a block or so away from where the Shermans had been destroyed, and told him there was a monster of a German tank around the corner. What happened next was a genuine act of courage that set up everything else. Early did not simply charge his tank around the corner into an unknown situation, which is how a lot of tank crews died. He climbed down out of Eagle 7 and went forward on foot, into a city full of the enemy, alone and lightly armed, to scout the Panthers' position with his own eyes, before risking his crew and his tank. It is hard to overstate how dangerous that was. A tank commander's protection is his tank. On foot in a contested city, he was as vulnerable as any infantryman, and if a German rifleman in any of 100 windows had seen him, the story would have ended there. And Bates, camera and film reels and all, went with him, because the cameraman was not going to miss what came next. The two men worked their way forward through the rubble and found a vantage point inside a building overlooking the plaza, and studied the Panther where it sat, its long gun pointed up the street where it had just killed the Shermans, its crew watching that same street for the next target. Early made his plan. Rather than come up the street into the front of the Panther, where its heavy frontal armor and deadly gun would have every advantage, he would bring his Pershing along a side street and dart into the intersection just far enough to fire into the Panther's flank, its weaker side, while its gun was still pointed the wrong way. It was exactly the right plan, the same logic that decides most tank fights, which is to hit the enemy where he is not looking and cannot quickly turn to face you. Early went back to his tank, mounted up, and gave the order to move. Bates positioned himself where he could film the intersection, braced his camera, and started it rolling. But in the minutes it had taken Early to scout the position and return to his tank, the situation had quietly changed, in a way that would nearly get his whole crew killed. The German commander, Bartelborth, had been worried about exactly the danger Early was about to become. He was aware that an enemy tank might try to come at him from that side street, and at some point he had ordered his own gunner to traverse the Panther's turret around to cover that approach. So when Eagle 7 came surging into the intersection, and Clarence Smoyer looked through his gun sight expecting to see the vulnerable flank of the Panther, he saw instead the muzzle of the Panther's gun swung around and pointing directly at him. For an instant, both tanks had each other, and in that instant the Germans hesitated. The reason, according to what Bartelborth later told his own family, was that he did not recognize the American tank. The Pershing was so new and had appeared in Europe in such small numbers that its silhouette was unfamiliar, and for a fatal moment the German commander was unsure whether the tank rolling into the intersection was an enemy at all, or one of his own. That hesitation, a second or two at most, was the difference between living and dying. Clarence Smoyer did not hesitate. The textbook told a gunner to stop the tank before firing, because a stationary tank is a stable gun platform and far more accurate, but stopping would have made Eagle 7 a motionless target directly in front of a Panther's gun, at a range where the German shell would not miss and might well punch through even the Pershing's armor. Smoyer had no time for the textbook and no intention of dying by it. His driver kept the tank rolling across the intersection so it would not be a sitting target, and Smoyer laid his sight on the Panther and fired on the move, a snapshot at a moving platform against a stationary enemy, the reverse of everything gunnery school taught, and he hit the Panther squarely. Then, as his tank cleared into the open, he fired again and again, putting 2 more rounds into the German tank. He did not stop at the first hit. He had seen what a wounded enemy could still do, and he wanted no chance that a dying German crew would get off a shot in return. Round after round went home. The Panther was finished. It caught fire and would burn for 3 days in front of the cathedral, a landmark of the battle that soldiers and civilians alike would remember. 2 of its crewmen managed to escape the burning tank and survive. The others did not. In the space of a few seconds, in the middle of a ruined intersection, the long story of American tankers being outgunned by German armor had, in this one small place, been turned on its head, and Jim Bates had filmed all of it. He had caught the Pershing surging into the intersection, The flash of the shots, the Panther erupting into flame, and the crews in the aftermath. Roughly 48 seconds of continuous film that captured a tank duel from beginning to end, an almost unheard of thing to have on record, because such fights were usually over in moments and no camera was ever pointed the right way at the right time. This time, one was. Jim Bates's footage was extraordinary, and it made the Cologne duel one of the most famous tank actions of the war, for a reason that has nothing to do with its size. The film was rushed back, developed and shown in newsreels in movie theaters across the United States, where audiences watched a real tank battle unfold on the screen in front of them, the burning Panther, the victorious Pershing, the young Americans who had won. In a war where almost all combat footage was fragments and glimpses, here was a complete, coherent, dramatic duel, and it seared itself into the public memory. It made Bates's reputation as one of the finest combat cameramen of the war. It made Clarence Smoyer, briefly, the most famous tank gunner in America. And it gives us, all these decades later, something history almost never provides, which is near certainty about a small, fast, violent event. We are not reconstructing the Cologne duel from conflicting memories and guesswork, the way we have to with almost every other action in this series. We can watch it. We know how it happened because a man with a camera chose to stand on that sidewalk and risk his life to record it, and then a second man chose to go forward on foot and let himself be filmed doing it. In a channel that spends most of its time carefully weighing disputed accounts and flagging what cannot be known, the Cologne duel is a rare and valuable thing, a battle we can simply see, frame by frame, exactly as it occurred. But a camera only records what is in front of its lens for the seconds it is running, and there is a great deal it cannot capture. It cannot capture what a moment costs a man over the rest of his life. It cannot show the 70 years that come after the 48 seconds. The film showed a triumph, clean and quick and thrilling, and that is how America saw it in the theaters, and that is how it is remembered. It did not show Katharina Esser dying in the street a short distance away in that same hour. It did not show the 3 men who burned in the first Sherman, or the German crewmen who burned in the Panther, and it did not show, because no camera could, the private weight that the young gunner in Eagle 7 would carry for the rest of his days. The most famous tank duel of the war is on film. The most important part of the story is not. The war ended 2 months after the Cologne duel. The men of Eagle 7 went home, and the footage of their moment played on, in newsreels and later in documentaries, a fixed image of young victory. But for Clarence Smoyer, the memory that lasted was not the burning Panther, it was the young woman by the car. For the rest of his long life, Smoyer carried the fear that it had been his shell that killed Katharina Esser. He could never know for sure, and that uncertainty was its own kind of weight. He was not a man who spoke easily about the war, and he lived quietly for decades, working and raising a family, carrying the memory privately. Then, in his 90s, his story was told in full for the first time, in a book that reconstructed the whole of his war and the Cologne duel in detail, drawing on his own memories and those of the men who had been there. Through that work, something remarkable happened. Smoyer was brought together with one of the surviving German crewmen who had fought on the other side that day, a man who had been a frightened young tanker himself in 1945. The 2 old enemies met, and instead of hostility they found they understood each other better than almost anyone else could. 2 men who had tried to kill each other as boys and now sat together as old men who had both simply been trying to survive a war they did not start. They became friends. And Clarence Smoyer went back to Cologne. He went to the cathedral that had stood over the duel, the same twin spires that had loomed over the burning tanks, and he lit a candle inside it. And he went to find the grave of Katharina Esser, the grocery clerk he had never met and had never stopped thinking about. Standing at her grave, an old man who had carried this for 7 decades, he asked the only thing he could. He asked her forgiveness, if it had been his shot that harmed her. As he put it, he asked her forgiveness if it was his shot that harmed her. Late in his life, the United States finally recognized what Smoyer had done in Cologne, and awarded him the Bronze Star, more than 70 years after the fact, in a ceremony at the National World War II Memorial. He was in his mid-90s by then. He was among the last of his crew left alive, and he died a few years afterward, one of the last of the tankers who had fought that day. The Cologne Cathedral duel was, in the cold terms of the war, a very small action. 1 German tank destroyed. It did not change the outcome in Cologne, which fell to the Americans regardless, and it did not change the outcome of the war, which was already decided. Measured by scale, it barely registers against the enormous battles of 1945. But it matters for two reasons, and they are worth being clear about. The first is what it represented. For years, American tank crews had fought at a disadvantage, dying in Shermans that could not match the German heavies. And the Cologne Duel was one of the first clear moments where that gap had finally closed, where an American tank met a Panther and won. It came too late to matter much to the war, but it mattered to the men who had waited so long for a tank that could fight on equal terms. And even here, the honest lesson is not simply that the better tank won. The margin in that intersection was not the Pershing's armor. It was a German commander's fatal second of hesitation, and an American gunner's decision to throw away the textbook and fire on the move rather than stop and die. The machine gave Smoyer a fighting chance. His nerve and his enemy's confusion decided the rest. The second reason is the one that lasts. The Cologne Duel is the rare battle that we can watch, and watching it, we see both halves of what war really is. We see the 48 seconds the camera caught, the skill and the speed and the courage, the clean and thrilling victory that played in the newsreels and made a young gunner briefly famous. And then, when we know the whole story, we see everything the camera did not catch. A grocery clerk dead in the street who should have lived. 3 American tankers dead in a burning Sherman. A German crew burning in their Panther. 2 of them scrambling out and the rest not. And a 21-year-old gunner who won the most famous tank duel of the war and spent the next 70 years asking a dead woman to forgive him, before finally standing at her grave to say it out loud. The film showed the triumph. The truth was the rest of it. That is the whole reason a story this small belongs on this channel. It is easy to make a war look like the 48 seconds of film, the duel, the winner, the burning enemy, the cut to black. Most of what gets told about war is exactly that. The highlight, the victory, the moment that fits on a screen. The Cologne Duel comes with its own footage, and the footage is genuinely thrilling, and it would be easy to stop there. But the men who were actually in it did not get to stop there. They carried the parts the camera missed for the rest of their lives, the dead civilian and the dead crews, and the doubt that never fully lifted. A gunner who understood the difference between the moment the world watched and the truth he lived spent his whole life carrying both. Telling it honestly means carrying both as well. At Cologne, the fight was over in seconds and lived on for 70 years. Next time on WARFRONT, we follow a small group of men sent to hold a position against an entire army, far from any help, in a place the world would spend decades trying to forget. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to WARFRONT and the next battle will find you.